Ben. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Also great. Excited to talk to you because this was a funny one. What I'll say right at the outset is we're securely reaching the part of the podcast where I don't like deeply, intimately know these songs in the way that I really do on some of these other albums. I mean, I'm fully aware and everything, but I'm kind of like revisiting in a way that's less about something that was like straight up defining a period of my life, you know? And so over the summer, I took a trip to Portugal with my wife and was on a trolley and like at some point checked cell phones and I had a message from you. Or you can correct me if it's such a daze, it's such a blur to me, but I remember
Yeah.
messaging you on, I guess, a Reddit DM or something like that about this piece and about the podcast, and you'd sent a really cool note about it. Is that
Yeah,
is that
yeah,
what we
that
did?
that totally accords. Yeah. Somewhere deep in the Reddit bowels of Connor Oberst fandom, we hooked up. Yeah.
I love it. And so what this piece is this is just part of the title, but taste has never met shame. And kind of what I want to say to you, that's the reason that your piece resonated to me, and it was written in the all like about 2010 or 11 when this record was on its way. We had a
Right.
release date and it was coming. Kind of, I don't what would you say is kind of the kind of basics of that piece? What were you trying to articulate in that?
So at that time I was 29, 30, something like that. And I was fully grappling with a thing that had been sort of somewhere in the periphery of my Bright Eyes fandom since the very beginning, which was like when I was 19, I think. I had my brother's friend who was just like always the like cool music viaduct for me. Like I thought like Weezer was indie, and he would like introduce me to, Joanna Newsom or whatever. Like he just really
Sweet.
was tapped into that at a different level. And he, in like a full like Garden State kind of moment, was just like, you have to hear this, and like put on something vague for me, which I'd never heard Conor Oberst before. And just like within 20 seconds of it, I was just like, oh, this is going to be a problem. Like there's just something in the quality of his voice or the song or something that just like was a puzzle piece in my brain and body for me.
Now and again, it seems worse than it is, but mostly.
But even from then, I was always aware that there was something a tiny bit like, it wasn't like liking Pavement or something. Like it rubbed some people the wrong way. There was something a tiny bit not cool about it. And there was a feeling, sort of a fear of mine, that I was going to outgrow it because I loved his music so much. But I had this sense when I was like going to a lot of shows of his and stuff, like, how am I going to be relating to like Halai Halai or whatever when I'm 25? Like, what is that going to sound like? So by this point, which is like 2010 or 11, when the People's Key was incoming, I felt no longer young. For like, I was approaching 30. And so it felt like I was officially kind of aging out of the acceptable Bright Eyes demographic in my mind. And yet I was super excited about this album. And so the piece, I just wanted to write about not succumbing to that, not pretending to like different stuff than I did in fact like Conor Oberst, I knew was embarrassing. And even within the arts, like it's not like he's the most sophisticated musician in the world. Like I've gone through so many phases in my life of wishing I like liked classical music. Like wouldn't it be cool to like be somebody who is conversant in that? And so this piece was to some extent just like making peace with like, I'm not like that. Like this is what moves me and this is what I love, and deal with it.
Are you the type of person to work out your feelings by writing them out and kind of this is like you exercising that process?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, it feels that way to me. I mean, what you're doing basically is saying like you're kind of contrasting taste with the things that you can kind of carefully choose to be like the signifiers of you versus what is just making things happen inside you, right?
Yeah, I read a really good phrase in an essay once where a guy said, he was talking about books, and he said there are no placebo books. If this like Dostoevsky book that you wish meant a ton to you, you can't just like take it in and like have it fake. Like if it hits or it doesn't, and you don't get to choose. And I don't
Yeah.
think there's placebo art. Like it's about the effect it has on you more than it is about how cool people think it is when they see what you're listening to.
It's actually pretty cool to talk about this right now at this time of year as well, because I'll read through like websites year-end lists of like bands and albums and things like that, and you can like, and I know I do it myself. Like if you look at like what I listened to the most this year versus what I say would be my favorite thing, like I'm sitting here deep in my head like, is it really, or is this what I want to be perceived as what is my favorite thing? I don't,
For sure.
like
Yeah.
we're all doing versions of that all the time, and
Yeah, you have like one eye on the mirror at all times when you're sort of composing the tastes that make up you. And it's a very self-conscious, uncomfortable process, I think.
yeah. What you have here, you have our sense of taste couldn't care less about our creatively plotted visions for ourselves, which I love. But I think there's, all right, so we're talking about this as like, oh my God, we just have to just be real with ourselves that we like this extremely, I don't know, embarrassing thing. But here's the thing, that's a conversation you can have. That's me like speaking hyperbolically, but it's kind of the way we're talking right now about like this is some pure embarrassing thing. But the reality is there's a second thing happening, which is it's not, it's
No, it's
very
not.
good. So it's, and the thing I like about your piece, which the reason it resonated so much, I think for me, is like I was early in the process of making this podcast, like just thanking fucking God that Tim Kasher came on the first episode of this show and just really excited about it. And what I was kind of like unlocking in my head was like a major kind of purpose of this, a major kind of reason is to do the job of explaining that, do the job of getting at why this is not that. And like, I honestly, in the podcast, I make a point not to refer to him as Connor. I make a point not to, I'm like so averse to becoming like in like fanboy voice of it or whatever. It's almost like, I'm going to say what I like and criticize what I don't and say what I liked then and feels weird now. And honestly, all that process is like, how do you go about this in a way that like hopefully unlocks some of the reasons this is more than just whatever like hair swooped in front of the face emo thing was happening at the very beginning.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like I don't want at all to sound like I relate or ever related to Conor Oberst as like, I wouldn't know any One Direction songs, but like my embarrassing like, teenage thing that I know is crap. I actually think Conor Oberst is amazing. And like I will go to the mat arguing that and do, but it's complicated. Like I think I was thinking about like I will often read like critics saying that like Buster Keaton was actually a genius, or Charlie Chaplin, like go back and watch these old movies. And so sometimes I will try to engage with some old thing that was like not taken seriously in its time, but now people are saying you should take it seriously. And I usually don't enjoy it that much. Like within 10 minutes, I'm a little bored and confused and I forget it. And I think the actual message of those like arguments is that it's okay to take seriously what seems like pure ephemera or not quite heavy art now. Like Will Ferrell might be Buster Keaton in 100 years. And I think it's perfectly likely that Conor Oberst, I mean, I know saying Bob Dylan is like an excruciatingly overdone thing, and I don't even know Bob Dylan that well, but just like this is what it feels like to be living at the same time that I think an artist who is going to last is making his music. And it is this weird dynamic of like recognizing his flaws, cringing occasionally, and knowing somehow that he just like has something like he does. Like I took piano lessons for a long time as an adult with like a very serious jazz musician, and like I would bring him stuff that I wanted to learn on the piano, and a lot of the stuff I brought, like I would whatever, Ben Queller or like Wilco or whatever, and I would play it for him, and he would kind of like dutifully figure out what chords it was and teach me. And I brought him Bright Eyes, and I was like a little nervous about it because he's not a great technical musician. I don't think he can't read music, I don't think, right? And I played it for him, and to my like delight, he was like, oh shit, that kid's got something. Like there is something there that is more valuable than any amount of musical education or whatever. So yeah, I don't want to downplay that at all.
I don't think I know that like we're not downplaying it. Obviously, we're on this talking about it in this conversation, but I think it's some awareness of a perception being this like, oh, they have this festival in Las Vegas called When We Were Young with a bunch of emo bands, and Bright Eyes is at it. And I think what it was like a thing back in the moment when that was happening of being, I mean, I was into like singer-songwriter music and lyrics. I'm 17 years old and loving Jackson Browne and shit. And that, I think it was my sort of like, I don't think you guys get it. This is a different thing than that. Like I either have neutral to negative feelings about whatever the word emo means. I really just don't know, really don't understand it. But in the moment was just like, I think I'm liking this for a completely different reason. And I don't remember if it was the Pitchfork review or your piece that kind of talked about like once you hit lifted, you kind of see that other thing. And then by the time you're past that, it's totally divorced from whatever connection it had to that kind of scene prior to it. But we're going to find our way, and we'll keep talking about this stuff as we go into People's Key. But do you care if I read a little bit of your thing back to you?
No, do it.
Okay. Years from now, when I'm wandering through life bald and LL Bean jacketed, I'll probably still be listening to him tremendously describing his beloved high school girlfriend combing her hair. And I'll probably still be ashamed and covered with goosebumps. But why the shame? And come to think of it, why the goosebumps? Beautiful. I love that. And then before we jump back in, the long version would include defensive references to Elliott Smith and Bob Dylan, as well as an anxious discussion of his surprising way with lyrics, his disarming voice, his shockingly steady output, and a dozen other things. The shorter and more honest version, though, would amount to not much more than play light pollution starting at 210, which is awesome, sounding like you're channeling like the big sister on the Zooey Deschanel character on Almost Famous, like about like side 2 of Led Zeppelin record or whatever. But it's right. The part where you say, I know it's like no one wants to bring up Elliott Smith and Bob Dylan and stuff like that, but the part where you say that in a way that's like kind of defensively saying like, no, this is of that thing, just resonates with me a ton. But like, why does it have to be said defensively? I think that says something about whether it's the perception of Bright Eyes or the perception of aging white guys' feelings about what the perception of Bright Eyes is or something like that. It's all a bunch of overthinking. And the thing I like about the piece and honestly, what I'm getting to do here is like cutting that away, you know?
Yeah, no, it definitely becomes very involuted. And I think there is a distinction. I mean, I don't know about Bob Dylan, but like whenever I think about Elliott Smith as he relates to Conor Oberst, it feels a little bit like, you know, driving next to a Tesla and you're in kind of like a taped together golf cart or something. Like, I feel like Elliott Smith is like really clearly very musically talented.
Yeah,
and like the production, you know, the way the vocals are doubled, and he's just like a beautiful singer. It's just like I could play those songs for my parents and I think they would get it. But Bright Eyes has this much more homemade, like I was thinking about how if you had like 2 fader knobs on like a whatever mixing board, you know, and like they are labeled, let's say like, I don't know, Sincerity and like Professionalism, right? So like collection of songs is like Sincerity is all the way up and Professionalism is all the way down, right? Like that's just pure feeling that is barely making its way onto tape, and it's awesome. And then over the course of his career, I feel like he's kind of pulling those things a little bit closer together. But what is so amazing about him, I think, is that he has the Sincerity thing. Like he brought in a lot more of that than it seemed to me that like a song could really carry, right? Like I had never known that much raw feeling to be brought into music, and yet he still had this ability to like write a hook and a melody and like these things that you really wanted to
and make that sincere thing artful and interesting. You know, you're talking about something vague, like it's not just him saying something sincere, it's him being like, wait, the way in which it's being said. But that honestly, you can kind of distill down some of the simple stuff we're talking about to the fact that it is sincere. You know, like you brought up Pavement a minute ago. Like that's like tossed off cool and not sincere and sort of cool in being the opposite of that, and this was pretty sincere and hard on sleeve. And
I mean, I saw Pavement like a few years ago. They were doing one of their like reunion things, and it was so depressing. Like it was not only because of like how they've aged, but just like that lack of, when a lack of sincerity is kind of your whole thing, that you're like a little bit above everything, like that ages really poorly. Like it's just like you're standing there playing someone else's music almost. Like there's this really detached, depressing feeling, and it felt like everybody in the crowd was super detached from it. And then I saw Bright Eyes, a month or two ago, and it was one of the better shows on this tour, and it was just so in it. One of the things I love so much about him is that he doesn't, maybe to his detriment, like bullshit in his music. Like he doesn't play old songs well unless he can somehow twist them and make them new. Like he refuses to fake his way through stuff. And I think it is probably like a very painful way to go through the world, to have to like feel everything so deeply as you're doing it, but it's delightful as an audience member.
Yeah. Every single one of those records through the 2000s round a new corner, including the two that come out on the same day. They're just like, it's all still Bright Eyes, but it all is deliberately changing in a way that's like kind of almost at every turn telling the audience who loves your music, like kind of challenging them to not like it a little bit. And yeah. I think we're at a part, like your piece is largely about like thinking about all of that kind of stuff and about what taste is and what and liking what you want to like and kind of navigating that whole conversation in anticipation of this record. I'm thinking about where I am. I was broke and just out of journalism school and living in San Francisco, and that when this would have come out. And so I think I was a little preoccupied. It was a weird time in my life, but I was not waiting for it. I don't even know. And I think that I in retrospect, like I talk a lot on the Casadega episode about kind of like the challenge I had with that, and I kind of never fully getting there all the way. This is like an extra little burn to the way that record felt for me, that I went from buying that one the day it came out to not even really following the release of this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is actually a really significant trajectory. Like I feel like this is the album. This is what year did he put out Casadega? 2006 or 7? Seven. So I feel like that interval between 2007 and 2011 is like when Bright Eyes outlived its kind of legend. I don't know exactly what age he was in there. I guess he's a couple years older than me, but like I feel like that was the first Bright Eyes album to come out when he had to kind of figure out what it means to officially be someone who like didn't die young, like who is going to continue to put out albums as he ages and become and that is what I really like about the album and find interesting about it, actually, is that it's like in a way the first posthumous Bright Eyes record, which doesn't make any sense, but like he didn't die obviously in that interlude, but the young Conor Oberst, who we all know from like 2000 to 2005, I feel like did die kind of in that period. And so there's something very like brave and interesting is, I feel like his grappling with, is he going to become like self-karaokeing the early records on this, or can he find some way to continue to change? What does it even mean to be like angsty and stuff as you are in your 30s? And so I just find it a fascinating record. And I think what your experience of like going from ardently standing outside the record store to like, oh wait, there's a new Bright Eyes album, you could kind of feel in the cultural air in that period.
Yeah, totally. Well, what's cool about it, and what's cool about being able to size it up from a distance, is like I listened to it over these last few days and a couple weeks ago, and kind of like little waves of it, and I love it. Like I really, really like the record a lot, and I say that in a way that's like, I think I don't have to tangle with any past relationships with it, any other feelings about it or anything. It kind of carries no baggage whatsoever, and like listening to it with your all piece in mind, like it's kind of nice to have him not be bearing it all out as a 30-something-year-old that's just going to be doing that same thing all the time. Like it feels like the thing I would like to hear at the age that I am. And it's like, it feels like, okay, you make these solo records and do this and write these songs, and now you're going to come back and make a Bright Eyes record, which means you're with Mike Mogus and Nate Walcott. And like the criticism in the Pitchfork review is that like Conor Oberst seems like receded a little bit, or like it's not just him. And I feel like, okay, well, if you're making solo records and these other collaborative things, the one you make a Bright Eyes record should probably sound like you and the two other guys from Bright Eyes. And it feels like that's kind of what they settled in and did. And I got to be totally honest, I barely hear the lyrics on it. That was true. That's true about Digital Ash and Digital Learn as well for me. Like, whereas I'm hearing every syllable of Lua.
Yeah.
And I'm there. I'm in that scene, you know. Digital Ash ones, like I had to discover, I don't know what it is, just it's like, okay, this is cool and stimulating music, but I need to like actively hardcore concentrate to be following what they're talking about. And that's becomes extra too when we're talking about like science fiction and Rastafarian stuff, you know, not the most well-versed.
And there's a lot of Hitler popping up. It's thematically kind of opaque and dense. I think a lot of songwriters talk about like they get the melody or whatever in their heads, and then they just like put down nonsense lyrics to kind of as placeholders, and then they're going to fill in the meaningful stuff. And there are places on this album where it feels like he stopped at the nonsense lyric phase. Like, I'm sure it meant a lot to him, but like there isn't, like, the first lyrics of Shell Games, which sounds just like people's key gobbledygook stuff. Actually, a Reddit user blew my mind with, do you know this?
No.
It's Took the Fireworks, which is the cover of Letting Off the Happiness of the Fireworks, and the Vanity, which is the mirror on the cover of Fear and Mirrors, the Circuit Board, which is Digital Ash, and the City Streets, which is I'm Wide Awake.
Bro.
And then Shooting Stars, Swaying Palm Trees, which is Casadega.
Oh my God.
So he does his whole discography, and then he's laid it at the Arbiter's feet.
Took the fireworks and the vanity, the circuit board and the city streets, shooting star, swaying palm tree, laid it at the Arbiter's feet. If I could change my mind, change the paradigm, prepare myself for another life, forgive myself for the many times I was cruel to something helpless and weak. But here I come, that heavy love.
So like the first real song of the album, he's like doing his whole, so I trust he's way smarter than me and better at lyrics, so I know there's a lot in there, but I agree with you that it has this kind of shellac of like impersonal, weird, symbolic systems that are hard to like get right away.
That is so cool. That has never occurred to me.
Me either.
And yeah, well, that's like a pretty, the way we're describing this moment and what they are in like popular consciousness and what they are going forward and everything. It's a pretty cool, artful recap of what brought you to this point.
Yeah,
and
he's always like, he is the same age as my older brother, so I feel like this like slightly older brotherly relation to him always. Like when I was growing up, I just always had this sense like whatever my older brother is into, it might look a little weird to me now, but in like 2 years, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's what that was about. Like I get that. So I feel like I always have this kind of weird sense that Conor Oberst is like a couple of steps ahead of me artistically, or just, and so it's fun to see with that kind of little lyrical thing, which I didn't know until a couple of years ago, that he was grappling with exactly the stuff we finally get around to thinking about.
Yeah. You mentioned Shell Games. So like Shell Games is the second song, but for all intents, like the kind of way Bright Eyes works, I feel like the second song is often the kind of like bombing in, like you're getting a real song kind of thing now.
Right.
And
right.
I think that and Jeju and Stars.
Every new day is a gift, it's a song of redemption.
Both of those songs are just like sonically very stimulating, energizing, and like release into really satisfying hooks. Like on Jeju and Stars, so I go umbrella under my arm, like melodic line is so just infectiously like a lot of what Casadega did was a sort of like, oh my God, is this song still plodding along right now? Which a lot of this says more about my need for like some candy to like make
Yeah.
me feel okay, you know, like, but those two songs give that to me and feel interesting. And then the like, that song also has like a cool little like kind of Cure style Boys Don't Cry guitar line, like doing its notes in the background of it.
So I go umbrella under my arm into the green of the radar. How'd it get so dark in the day? It's just so bizarre. Is it true what we're made of? Why do I hide from the rain?
Love
Yeah, no, those
songs.
are really joyful. Like, I was at a concert of his in like 2002, and this was like when his image in the culture and mostly in my mind was just like, is he even going to be able to like get through the concert because he's in so much pain, like sitting there like trembling on his stool with like tears in his eyes, kind of thing. And so I went to the show, and he started playing Loose Leaves, which is like a really joyful group. And a friend and my friend and I looked at each other and were like, what the fuck is this? Like, we didn't know this like charismatic, energetic side of him, which of course you have to have if you're gonna be like a rock star for decades. And so I feel like those first tracks on People's Key are very much out of that side of him, that they're really, and that out of that side of the group, that they're very, as you say, like joyful and hooky and energetic. And it's like there's so many points on the album, like the last track, the One for You, One for Me, where like I was trying to imagine if in the Fevers and Mirrors era you'd been like, that guy is going to be like walking around a stage with just like the mic kind of like singing this like funky, it's just such a different side of himself, and I love that.
One for the pure, one for his child bride. One for the wedding, one for the suicide. One for the bunker, one for the broadcast booth. One for me, now one for you.
I think there's a feeling of, to me, like, and this is on revisiting, like I remember listening to it and liking Shell Games and liking the record enough as I slowly got to it, but wherever I was in life, I wasn't just like hanging on to it hard. I think we also might have been like far enough removed from, like, maybe I didn't have a CD player anymore. I successfully skipped like paying 99 cents per song on iTunes, and
Right.
streaming was kind of there but coming, and I probably didn't have it yet. And like it honestly kind of might have existed in that little pocket of like I kind of was like a little bit rudderless in terms of discovering listening to music anyways, you know. I know I was rudderless in other ways, but
yeah, there was definitely a weird like post-Napster pre-Spotify window in there.
Mm-hmm. Before jamming forward to some other songs, do you have any feelings about the intro track and the kind of interstitial, the guy Denny Brewer?
Yeah, I really like them actually.
So do
Like, I mean the intro song, like I think I heard Connor Oberst joke at a concert once that's like a song that no one likes, Firewall, that he played it and like maybe like two people clapped or something and he was like, oh, finally somebody or whatever. But I kind of like it. It's like very like hypnotic and loopy. But the interstitial talking, I kind of love. Like I'm just fascinated with voices, and just that guy clearly has just like, I mean, physically, like the actual sound of his voice
Yeah.
is kind of cool. But I just also really like what he's saying in kind of a loopy way. Like it obviously doesn't make a ton of linear sense talking about like lizard people and time travel and pomegranates and stuff, but there is some level, if I kind of like let my mind go slack, that I think what he's saying is like really beautiful and cool. And I'm every time he shows up on the album, I'm kind of like, cool, especially the end. Like we can talk about that when we get there, but like the very final thing, after the final song of him, I think is really like a beautiful piece of like sonic art.
It's nicely placed. Yeah. And they got the little spots where every once in a while one word kind of is doubled over and stuff like that. Don't let this, because I really like them too. And I think I like that those intro tracks exist broadly. And then some of them I like more than others. And this one is kind of is what it is. His voice is interesting. You're hearing clean audio right away and you're just kind of listening, right? I had a thought that like I'm either gonna try and purge this thought or I'm gonna actually edit it in and do it. But I had this feeling of like him talking about like the reptilians and all of this stuff, and then cutting in like Joe Rogan's voice going like, "Holy shit, dude, this is like," because there's a way you can spin it to like, this man has unlocked the fucking truth and no one else can understand it, and him and Rogan are doing 3 hours.
And they had tails, they had a few reptilian features on them. They could phase shift from one dimension to another dimension. And the people who know say it's from the fourth dimension, it's the next dimension. Space is expanding. There's spirits coming from the center, right? We're going counterclockwise. There's supposed to be 8 other universes going counterclockwise, and that's called super universe. You know, and love's always been the message. It's just circumstances happen, right? People freak out, just flat flip out, you know? Well, that's where Hitler came from. Hitler came from that way. He was an outspoken, charismatic yeller. And all these people say, hey, we use this guy. Look at all these people listening to this cat. You know what I mean? And so that's just one of the trips like that. You know, it still exists. And their bloodline goes back into Sumerian times. You know, they didn't call it reptilians, or they didn't call it but they did, because they call him Satan, they call him the devil, and it's the same damn trip. It's a negative force coming in on a positive force because it's just
yeah. No, I know that's exactly, yeah, it can definitely like bleed into QAnon's stuff in maybe an uncomfortable way, but like I just take it as like, you know, you've got a long wait at a bus station and just like the guy next to you starts talking, and like kind of interesting if you sort of like turn something off in yourself.
I'll take listening to someone say interesting things for as long as they want to, regardless of how much sense they make, than someone coherently making sense in a boring way. I mean, it's like the stuff about the pomegranates, like I'm a fan too.
Yeah, no, there's something really beautiful about it. And especially with like the music, you know, lightly underneath it, like I think it's really well edited and culled together. And they let him go on. Like really, there are minutes of his talking, I feel like, throughout the album.
In the re-listening back, like I haven't been inclined to skip. I listened to the man.
Yeah, no, me too. Yeah.
So you get those kind of like two kind of songs that feel like real banger type songs to me. And then, I mean, a beautiful thing Bright Eyes does is like on Fevers and Mirrors, you get these songs that kind of do the same thing as those two in their own Fevers and Mirrors type way. And then you get like a Sunrise Sunset that feels a little more like two chords kind of going back and forth in a way that's not designed to be, it's mood making, you know, above all else.
Someone like losing their mind in a rocking chair kind of feeling.
Exactly.
Just like
sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset, swiftly go the days. Sunrise, sunset, you wake up and you undress it always.
The best albums always have that, right? No one wants 10 verse, chorus, verse pop songs in a row, or at least I don't. And this record does a good job, I feel like, with like Approximate Sunlight and a few of these, and even Haile Selassie. Am I saying it right?
You're Haile Selassie. I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. They managed to be that and provide that in this record, but also be songs I still want to hear every time. I mean, it's really not a record where I skip songs.
Pilgrim across the water, we are the same, brother, hitchhiking back to Zion, holding our tears as we flip the album. What if this leads to ruin? You got a soul, use it, all this despair forgiven, rolling away on the wheel of sevens, sings like the Queen of Sheba.
Yeah, no, when I went into re-listening to it, for this, like I had the impression that there was kind of a mushy stretch of like a Machine Spiritual, Triple Spiral, Beginner's Mind. Like those weren't songs that like if they came on like a general shuffle mix that I was usually like excited about. But actually listening to them in their context now, like I didn't want to skip any of them. Like I feel like in the context of the album, each song has kind of a lot going for it. And Approximate Sunlight is, I think, a really interesting like gear shift down from those first two songs.
And you get Denny Brewer talking after Jejune Stars, right? So then into Approximate Sunlight. And yeah, it feels like act one ending and now we're into another act.
Used to dream of time machines. Now it's been said we'll post everything. As a child imagining neckties and coastlines, I seen the show, man. What a sight. Drenched us in approximated sunlight. The crowd was small and mostly blind, but kind. You're too kind. Now you are how you were when you were real.
It feels nicely ordered, and honestly, like that's, I don't need to like make it my whole deal to like slag Casadega, but like that's the one where like, oh, this song's probably serving its purpose in the larger vision of what's happening here, and clearly it's thought out and done with a real like sheen to it. But I don't want to hear it again, and I don't know how to describe that, but I just don't.
For me, Casadega is maybe the only album in which those like professionalism versus sincerity faders started to creep into like dangerously professional territory. Like it feels a little over slick. Like it could have used some of the rough edges that I think do come. Like one of my favorite moments on this album, People's Key, is in Triple Spiral, where he says something, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, the moment when I needed you. And like everything in your being is waiting for him to say the most. Like it's just this rhyme that is hanging there. And instead he says, when I needed you, when I needed you. He just like repeats it.
I love you, triple spiral, Father, Son, and Ghost. But you left me in my darkest hour when I needed you.
There's like a 3-second moment that is like condenses a lot of what I love about Bright Eyes and about this album. That just, it has more feeling than you would think could be packed into those words or in them. And there is just this kind of really interesting lyrical, like, you know, when you're like going up the stairs in the dark and you like stamp really hard on what you think is a stair, but it's actually the landing or whatever. Like there's a really weird feeling that he generates in you very quickly. It's almost like a joke, like it has a little punchline of skipping that lyric. And so that's a moment for me where I'm on this album like, oh, good, it's not overly slick. Like there's still some raw, personal, interesting decisions being made in here.
It's like depriving you of the satisfying thing you are anticipating in that moment. A thing I wasn't aware of around it, and we'll come back to some songs in a minute, but I guess if I wasn't paying a ton of attention in that moment, I wasn't aware that it had like swirling conversation around it being a final Bright Eyes record. Like he doesn't say that definitively either, I think, but it seems like it's part of the conversation around it.
Yeah, I remember a certain amount of finality as it was coming. Like it seems weird given how rocky the decade since then has been. But I remember going into this album, it already felt like kind of a crisis album. That like I remember reading some article that he was like telling his friends throughout the making of it that this was never going to happen. He was going to have to go get a straight job. Like this is just, and there's a longer interval in the making of this album, I feel like, than in most of his albums.
Sure.
So I think there was definitely a sense that maybe the Bright Eyes project had been played out at this point, or he was tapped out, or something was done, was I feel like definitely in the air. And in fact, it took 9 years to get another album. And maybe that was the last one.
And yeah, maybe. I know that they were signed for this one to make 2 records, but then they've been making this like the reissued like covers version, which I don't remember at what point. I've read too much Bright Eyes things in the last 6 months or whatever. But unsure, but it's possible that that thing satisfies the second record on that, if in that deal. Not, who knows, but
that would be a bummer.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily one of these people who is like a purist for the magic that is when like Conor Oberst, Mike Mogis, and Nate are together. Like those are the only canonical albums, and everything else. Like I'm pretty much here for Conor Oberst, and like I like when the other stuff is around it. But you know, if he continues to make albums, it won't be completely heartbreaking to me if there's never one put out under the Bright Eyes name. They have a special something, but like it doesn't seem to me of a different species than the rest of it.
I agree with you on that. You could argue that some of those solo records are some later solo records are closer to early Bright Eyes records than this record is to, you know, like it.
Yeah, for sure.
And honestly, I agree with that too. I think that some sort of sentimentality at the very beginning that connected me with Bright Eyes had me like, it had some effect, you know, but I thought about it as I went about making this project, like, well, like it's a little bit arbitrary to a certain degree if a lot of this is built off this songwriter and this person's songs. And honestly, the decision to make sure and just stay with Bright Eyes was out of a pure survival of like, there's just too much other stuff to do, you know?
Yeah, no, you'd be like a python swallowing an alligator or whatever.
Hold on tight, beginner's mind. The current's far too strong. It will carry you along till you're just like everyone. Stay a while, man and a child. I'd like to learn your trick, to know what makes you tick, to nurse you when you're sad.
But I don't think it's going to be one of those bands like the Rolling Stones or something where it's like you have to understand the chemistry and the interplay between these particular musicians. Like I think this is going to be a guy who is amazing and surrounded himself with musicians who were able to translate that in a bunch of awesome ways. But like he is still, I think, very, very much the indispensable piece, clearly.
I love your visual with the two dials, the professionalism and sincerity. He made that collection of songs, and clearly some people in a similar scene as him who were older decided to go about the process of helping him record more of them and up the fader on the professional side a little bit, and basically like kind of help guide him along that way and make the songs he wanted to make. Like there's some Conor Oberst quote that's like, I don't know, I would say with the sound I would hope to try to make, and Mike Mogis would try to make it. Obviously, that there's maybe less of a need for that now in that moment. I mean, I think that's like legitimately explains Fevers and Mirrors and Lifted and Digital Ash and I'm Wide Awake It's Morning to its different kind of degree, you know?
It's cool. No, that I think that's the same quote I'm thinking of where he, in some interview or something, said that like he will say something completely abstract, or like he says, I think like I want this to sound like ice breaking. And Mike Mogis will be like, I know exactly what you mean, and like go off and like create it on, you know, and I love that actually. I think that's such a cool, those are my favorite kind of people who can just like take anything in and translate it into something that is more what you were talking about than you knew.
Yeah.
And Conor Oberst seems like he could use that. Like I like Ruminations.
Love it.
I mean, Ruminations is that is so sincere, it like breaks you almost, and it's just him alone. I like that much more than Salutations, but I think it's almost like mathematically you can see, okay, let's subtract the Mike Mogis from everything else. What does this look like completely alone? And like that's what it is. Just like songs that are in a way very similar, but each one completely wrenching and just like almost an uncomfortable intimacy. I think it's a fascinating, amazing album.
It seems like that one had kind of a broad effect like that. Maybe like, because I was still not paying a ton of attention, and I clung to that album and absolutely loved it too. And it's come up multiple times in this series, and I think that probably is just a set of people kind of down to just hear Conor Oberst play you some songs that he wrote, you know, let that be that.
And I think it also like kind of answers a complicated question that like hangs over the Bright Eyes project, which is like, your feelings are just way more intense when you're whatever 18 to 22 than they are when you're mid 30s 40s. Like I don't have as intense an emotional experience of life as I did then, and I think that's just normal. And so when there's a new Bright Eyes record, and this People's Key is probably the first one fitting into that like more emotionally muted phase of my own life, like, do I want it to like rip me open the way that like the young ones did? Like, is that what exactly are you looking for from as emotionally intense an artist? Like, how do you connect with a 40-year-old who isn't like anguished with unrequited love for the girl who sits next to him in class or whatever, hopefully, the way an 18-year-old is? And I feel like Ruminations is, in a dark way, like kind of the answer to that. Like that makes 40-year-old me feel as much as Beavers and Mirrors made 19-year-old me feel. It's just a whole different set of feelings. I think that is what was so weird about the When We Were Young concert thing, that he is not one of these artists who's just going to be like the same emo haircut above like an increasingly aging face. Like he's not going to replay his 18-year-old feelings. He's not going to pretend to be stuck in those, and he's not actually going to be stuck in those. Like it is new. He's singing about like brain aneurysms or something. Like it's completely different types of misery in a way on that album, and I think that's what's so cool about it.
Yeah, totally. So Ladder Song, I think is a beautiful song. Ladder Song into One for You and One for Me. I think it's a really well, we've kind of been getting at this, but I think it's a really well sequenced record.
Yeah, that Ladder Song into One for You, I think, is maybe the best, my favorite, like 2-song sequence on a Bright Eyes album. I think Ladder Song is, for me, is sort of Poison Oak or something. Like it's just a very stripped down, painful. Like I was about to say that there were no like goosebump moments for me on this album, that it's mostly just like kind of pleasant. I mean, pleasant is kind of a shitty word, but it's mostly just fun. But Ladder Song actually is for me a goosebump song. It's really heartbreaking.
No one knows where the ladder goes. You're gonna lose what you love the most. You're not alone in anything. You're not unique in dying. Feel estranged every now and then. Fall asleep reading science fiction. I wanna fly in your silver ship. Let Jesus hang and Buddha sit. It's on.
Yeah, the way it just like rides off into the sunset of One for You, One for Me, I think is just perfect. I think that's such a great sequence.
And Ladder Song, you talk about the sheen of like the previous record and where things were going. Ladder Song is like deliberately played on this not professional sounding piano, this kind of like a little bit old timey. You're kind of uneasy a little bit. It adds a lot to it.
I feel like the like moment I kept hearing about on this tour, this latest tour of his, was when people were like concerned, was that he would not know the lyrics or the chords to Ladder Song, that like Mike would have to come over and like position his hands correctly on the piano or whatever. And I feel like even in the proper recording of it, it feels a little bit like perilous. Is he going to get through this? Like it just feels like an inherently very fragile, like one take kind of song.
Welcome to New Age, covered in warrior paint, lights from the jungle to the sky. See now a star's born, looks just like a blood orange. Don't it just make you wanna cry? Precious friend of mine. Well, I know when it's finally done, this whole life's a hallucination. You're not alone in anything. You're not alone in trying to be.
So So you talked a little bit about our boy Denny Brewer and his like final monologue at the end of One for You, One for Me. What's he talking about?
God, what the fuck is? I mean, I know it ends on that. Like, oh, that. So that's the one that's kind of like a plea for love, right? It's like a,
Yeah.
love will come out in the end. But what I really like about the final seconds of it is he is fumbling for a word.
Yeah.
Like he says something like compassion or something, and then he's like, no, it's not that. And a voice who isn't his, I don't know if it's Conor Oberst or somebody else, it doesn't sound like Conor Oberst, says mercy, or you just hear them suggest something and then he says, yeah, mercy, and that's it. I read it, probably overread it, as like sort of tying a bow around the whole album, which, from those Shell Games lyrics is a kind of like reckoning with his career thus far. And like, how do you make peace with it and move on and whatever? And I think his answer, which sounds kind of corny to say on a podcast, is like a kind of mercy.
So enlightenment is knowledge. As much knowledge as you can get people to seek and understand, and it's mankind, it's me and you, it's us that do it. But we have to call it to a line. We say, look, I'm not going to go kick that guy's ass. That happened 10 years ago. I wish him all the luck in the world. That's love, compassion, or what do you call it?
Mercy.
What's that?
Mercy.
Mercy.
Like I kind of love, like just understand all of that music was sincere when it was made and has a lot of good stuff in it, and just approach it with appreciation and love. And there's, yeah, I mean, the philosophical stuff of this album, One for You, One for Me, like in a way, like a very cornily sincere plea for like a kind of, we're all one. It could almost be a cheesy sentiment, except I think it's so genuine that it works.
I think part of the reason a lot of these records are so relevant or so powerful is that they're taking one simple, borderline cheesy, but kind of universal and resonant thing, and then unpacking it in a way that's unique and interesting. Like there's a reason some things are like that, and just the example, it's just the guy talking, but like, you wouldn't want to say like, oh, this song's about mercy. We're talking about mercy. That's the message we have here. But if you have this guy who just got done talking and kind of meandering through all this stuff and then kind of fumbling around for a word, and then someone says mercy and it says, oh yeah, mercy. And you get this like affected version of that. And then boom, you're out. The record's over. You hang on that moment. You think on that for a minute, you didn't know that it was about to be done. And now you're done. And it's not accidental. It's so cool.
Yeah, no, it's like a bell strike or something that just like hangs in the air after the record. And you're right. I think that the greatness of Conor Oberst and these records is that like simple, borderline trite thing being made fresh. Because like, of course, it is trite stuff that is most deeply true and important at the end of the day. Like on people's deathbeds, they aren't like, God damn, like that really complicated thought I had was like the really important stuff. And just like, let me get out my notebook and my footnotes and stuff, that it's, of course, it is simple stuff like love and mercy. And what I love so much about Conor Oberst is his willingness to be the guy who will risk seeming embarrassing or dumb, or not dumb, but just unsophisticated. Like, I think it takes a genuine bravery to not only wear your hurt so plainly, but just like wear your joy so plainly. And his answers for things are often like there's a moment on one of his solo records where he's like, love is the answer, full stop. And just, yeah, it is.
I know you have lifted all about a thing about like friends coming together to get you out. Like that could easily be absolutely cheesy. And then like you're a fiction writer, you're a creative, imaginative person. Fevers and mirrors and clocks and scales, like people have abused these things as symbols in writing a lot. You could easily land there. I said it on that episode, but like
it's not like some James Joyce thing where you have to like pore over his lyrics and find all of the complicated references for the most part. Like there is some of that, I guess, on People's Key, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. But there's genuine clever, fresh ways of approaching this material, like mirrors and clocks and whatever it is, that yeah, would just be deathly in the hands of the typical, like, teenage poet or whatever. It's
Yeah.
He's got a real gift.
All right, so you're a novelist and you've listened to this music over a long period of time. Surely you have your influences from that world that you work in.
Yeah.
Has this influenced you?
Well, I mean, my third novel is called At the Bottom of Everything, which is
Nice.
Which was like, it has nothing to do with Bright Eyes or Conor Oberst or anything, but there's a scene in it that involves like people being stuck in a cave in India, and like I had to come up with a title because like the publication date was approaching, and I was just sitting there like, down in the bottom, like what the, and it was like, at the bottom of everything. That sounds kind of oh fuck, like it's
Nice.
like it's this like pre-existing phrase that feels like carved out. So that was definitely the biggest moment of Bright Eyes explicitly influencing my writing. But I do feel like actually it's not. I remember a moment of listening to. I was struggling with one of my books and listening to Lifted. I think it was Nothing Gets Crossed Out or something, and just something about the like purity of the project, like having the sense that they would be making this music if there were a meteor headed toward Earth. Like there's just something about art for art's sake that is like joyful and cathartic, and that whole like I feel better when I sing side of the project that has been really, really useful to me as a writer. Like just trying to get back in touch with, like I there's on YouTube there's a song, I don't know if there still is, but there once was a song that Conor Oberst wrote when he was like 12 or 13, I want to say, called like Space Invaders or something. It's like about a video game, but it's like very good. It somehow turns the game into something kind of rich and awesome, and it's a good song. And his voice has not changed yet, and so it's like hilarious but amazing, because you see this like absolutely germinal thing that is that would grow into this giant career.
I know what you're thinking, or at least I think I do. What's on my mind isn't half of what's on yours. And I turn to you quaking, and I'm wrapped in your old man coat, like a present or broken in leather shoe. And buried in that warmness, I can't even remember my fears. Is it obvious to you yet that you hold me up? Is it obvious to you yet that you keep me up? Do you know that you hold me up? And my planet is safe for now. And my planet is safe for now. Space invaders getting closer, and my spaceship's not sure how to fight them without you. To fight them without you. Can't fight them without you. Without you.
And so I feel like that's a very, for me, when I'm lost in writing, to try to get back in touch with like fifth grade Ben, who is alone at his Apple IIe and just like typing for the joy of it and just like the pleasure of making up stories. Like that thing is sort of imperishable, and it is the kind of like little nuclear reactor at the center of your artistic life, if you can kind of keep it alive. And I feel like he's such a great example of that.
That's beautiful, and I also hope I can find that song. I'm gonna go look in.
It's really great and funny. It's awesome.
Should have been episode 1. And I'll look around, but no, the spirit of what you're saying is still a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of conversation on this podcast about just doing things, just making them, whether it's music or whether it's things in your life. Silence the editor for a minute and just find some flow,
Yeah.
it's funny you talk about the titling thing. I had this horrible insurance transcription job right after college, and then I ran into a newspaper editor from my hometown, and I wrote a couple like unpaid columns for them, and she's like, you should do more of these, like let's have you do them. And I was kind of getting into writing then. I mean, I was writing, but I was getting into like what I would eventually go and do in journalism and stuff. And she's like, let's get a name for your column. We need a name for it. And I was this is probably, I mean, I'm listening to a lot of Bright Eyes at this time. And I remember saying that I wanted to name it Buried Under the Influence, which is like from Let's Not Shit Ourselves. Like it's a tossed off line and Let's Not Shit Ourselves. And she just wrote back like, it sounds like you're on drugs or dying or no, they're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
Yeah, I was kind of amazed actually that my editor let me title the book that. But I was very pleased to discover that you cannot copyright titles. So it was like not a problem.
Wow.
But also that I just in the like Denny Brewer sense that like, you know, syllables or frequencies. I think there's something about the arrangement of syllables at the bottom of everything that just like sounds cool. That my editor, who I'm certain had never heard a second of Bright Eyes, is like, huh, that's cool. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, no, there's this movie everyone's arguing about right now on Netflix, Glass Onion. That's just a Beatles song, right? The movie has nothing to do with that.
Oh, is that where that comes from?
That's just the title of a Beatles song. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pure music. That's it.
Sweet. Well, where can people find you, or anything we've missed before we kind of? No,
I feel like this feels like a cathartic airing of every Bright Eyes related thought I've ever had. No, this feels good.
I love it. Were you? I should have clicked on your name on there, but were you writing for the AWL often? Then that was like I was in an early like understanding where to write on the internet and kind of figuring things out. And I remember this period of time thinking like, this is like the best version of someone trying to do things slightly different or askew. I just remember feeling like that was a really great version of the internet. Everything on there was for me. There was a lot of things on there that were beyond me, but that was kind of the point, you know, the point was this one's going to be very much for me.
Yeah.
There was a certain freedom to it. I'm sure it paid very little and everything, but it just was great.
Yeah. I don't remember if it paid at all.
Probably not. Yeah.
Some of them, but no, that was a very like important place for me to like first begin to find myself as an essayist. Like I would have an idea for something like this that, I mean, you know, good luck trying to convince like GQ or something that they should run 1,100 words of your random feelings about Bright Eyes. And yet this wasn't just like Live Journal where it was just like so much people just venting their unedited thoughts that it was just like not even worth reading. Like this was they really got the balance right. The editor, whose name I'm almost certainly going to mispronounce, Corey Sika, was like just a really generous, amazing helper of young talent. So that was a really, really important place for me that I was writing a bunch at that point.
Yeah, it's the best. That was a little added extra thing when I got this article from you. It was like, oh wow, that's not only about this record that came out in 2010 or 2011. That's like a site I would go to, type into my search bar on my web browser daily at that time in my life. That's so cool.
Yeah. When that died, it was really like the official end of an era for sure.
Sort of like, this is dead. This is sad. Of course it's dead. Everything like this dies. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, it was too good to live.
Well, where can people find you and anything you're doing, or what do you have? If you like to...
I do have a website, which is just my name, bendolnick.com. I have like a mercifully or maybe unwisely like non-existent social media persona. So just like, sometimes I have essays come out, and even less frequently than that, I have books come out. So I do have a newsletter where I have a newsletter called One Sentence on Substack, where I write about my favorite sentences from books. So that exists.
Beautiful. That's great. That is very good. Well, I very much enjoyed this. Thank you for coming on it. And it's been cool just connecting with you generally.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry if it's scary for me to depend on you. I don't mean to be a burden at all. I decided in the silence that I can't do this alone. I need safety and hope that like a clownfish and a sea anemone. Yeah, that's a sweeping